Imagine a world torn between two faiths, two empires, and two destinies. A world where ordinary farmers turned into warriors, kings marched side by side with beggars, and entire nations moved toward a single city, Jerusalem. This was not just a war. It was a holy promise, and the beginning of one of history's most brutal and legendary conflicts, the Crusades. Welcome to Sun Gurru, where history speaks. Here, we uncover forgotten battles, untold stories, and the truths that shaped our world. If you're passionate about history that still echoes in today's world, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay with us till the end, because the story of the Crusades will change the way you see history forever. To understand why the Crusades began, we need to step back into the 11th century. Europe was restless. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in the West, but Europe itself was poor, divided, and constantly at war with itself. Lords fought lords, knights fought for glory, and peasants struggled to survive. Meanwhile, in the East, the Islamic world was flourishing. The Seljuk Turks, a rising Muslim power, controlled vast territories, from Persia to Anatolia. And at the heart of it all was Jerusalem, a sacred city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. For centuries, Christians had been making pilgrimages to Jerusalem. But when the Seljuks took control, rumors spread across Europe that pilgrims were being harassed, that holy places were being desecrated, and that the path to salvation was under threat. And so, the stage was set. Fear, faith, and politics, all about to ignite into a firestorm that would burn for 2 centuries. At the center of this restless Europe stood one man who would change history forever, Pope Urban II. He was not born into wealth or royalty, yet he rose through wisdom, ambition, and unshakable faith to command the most powerful institution in the West, the Catholic Church. In an age when kings often trembled before papal authority, Urban carried both the burden and the brilliance of that power. Urban was no ordinary priest. He was a strategist, a politician, and above all, a visionary. He understood the fears of kings who were losing control, the ambitions of nobles hungry for land, and the desperation of peasants who longed for meaning beyond endless suffering. As he looked across Europe, he saw a continent tearing itself apart. Castles burned in rival feuds, knights wasted their strength in petty wars, and common people lived in misery. Yet in this chaos, Urban saw possibility. If this restless energy could be united under one sacred purpose, Christendom could become unstoppable. And then came the moment that would change everything. A letter from the East. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, once the guardian of the ancient Christian empire, now stood on the edge of ruin. Seljuk armies pressed hard against his lands, and Constantinople itself was threatened. In desperation, Alexios turned westward, sending a plea across the continent: "Help us, or Christendom will fall." To many in Europe, this was distant news from a faraway empire. But to Urban, it was revelation. This was more than a war. This was a divine opportunity to rescue Christians in the East, to seize back the holy city of Jerusalem, and to unite every kingdom, every knight, every peasant under a single banner, the banner of the cross. Urban's mind blazed with possibilities. A crusade would not only save Byzantium, it would heal Europe's divisions, raise the authority of the Church, and promise eternal salvation to all who joined. The year was 1095, and the Council of Clermont had drawn nobles, knights, priests, and peasants from across France. Thousands filled the fields, waiting to hear the Pope's words. Urban stepped forward, not as a king or warrior, but as the voice of God's will. He spoke of the suffering of Christians in the East, of holy places defiled, of pilgrims attacked on sacred roads. He painted Jerusalem not just as a city, but as the heart of Christendom itself, bleeding, calling for rescue. His voice rose like thunder, carrying across the fields, igniting something deep within the hearts of all who listened. He promised forgiveness of sins, eternal glory, and a crown in heaven for those who took the cross. For knights weary of endless wars, it was purpose. For peasants drowning in misery, it was hope. For kings, it was power. The words burned into their souls. until the crowd erupted in a single cry. Deus vult. God wills it. In that moment, the Crusades were born. The year was 1095. The air in Europe was thick with rumors, fears, and expectations. Something was coming, something greater than any war Europe had yet seen. At the heart of it all stood Pope Urban II. With the letter from Byzantium still fresh in his mind, he began to prepare not just a response, but a revolution. Urban chose the Council of Clermont as his stage, a gathering of nobles, bishops, priests, and common folk. Here, in this small French town, he would summon all of Christendom to a holy cause. In the weeks leading to the council, messengers carried invitations across the land. Knights rode in from distant castles, priests marched from faraway parishes, and peasants walked for days just to hear the voice of the Pope. By the time the council opened, Clermont was transformed. Its streets overflowed with pilgrims, its fields became camps for knights and nobles, and the sound of prayers echoed across the town. Urban knew this was more than a speech. It was destiny. Every word he spoke had to strike like thunder, to ignite kings, to inspire peasants, and to bind all of Europe under a single holy banner. Behind closed doors, he rehearsed his vision: the liberation of Jerusalem, the salvation of souls, the unity of Christendom, the promise of eternal reward. On the day of the council, as the sun rose over Clermont, thousands gathered. Some came with hope, others with fear, and many with restless ambition. But all eyes turned to the man who would speak for God himself. Pope Urban II stepped forward, lifted his hands to the sky, and prepared to unleash a call that would echo across centuries. The crowd held its breath as Pope Urban II raised his voice. His words were not just heard. They thundered across the square, piercing hearts and souls alike. "Brothers and sons of Christ," he began, "you fight and kill one another in useless wars, spilling Christian blood for nothing but pride and greed." Faces in the crowd shifted. Knights lowered their eyes. Peasants nodded. Priests whispered prayers. For every man there, his words rang true. "But now," Urban continued, his voice rising, "a greater cause calls you. Our Christian brothers in the East suffer under the hands of the Turks. The Holy Land, the land where Christ lived, died, and rose again, groans under their rule." Murmurs swept through the crowd. The name of Jerusalem carried a power that no crown, no sword, no kingdom could rival. "You are warriors," Urban declared, "yet you waste your strength on petty quarrels. Take up the arms of Christ, march eastward, and God himself shall lead you." His words struck like lightning. In that moment, fighting lords imagined themselves as champions of God. Peasants saw themselves as soldiers of heaven. Every soul felt lifted beyond its misery. "Whoever goes, whoever fights, whoever dies in this holy cause," Urban cried, "shall have their sins forgiven. An eternal reward awaits in heaven." That promise, forgiveness, salvation, eternal paradise, shook the crowd to its core. Men who had lived in guilt, warriors who had slaughtered for greed, now saw redemption within reach. A roar rose from the crowd. It began with a few voices, then dozens, then thousands. "Deus vult! Deus vult! God wills it! God wills it!" The chant thundered across Clermont, unstoppable, uncontrollable. It was no longer just Urban's voice. It was the voice of Christendom itself. In that single moment, history changed. Beggars became warriors. Sinners became crusaders. And Europe began to march toward Jerusalem. While Pope Urban's words ignited the nobles and kings, another figure rose who would awaken the hearts of the common people. He was no prince, no bishop, no warrior, but a poor, ragged monk. His name was Peter the Hermit. Small in stature, thin from years of fasting, with a long, unkempt beard and piercing eyes, Peter seemed an unlikely leader. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried a fire that reached even the humblest peasant. In village squares and marketplaces, he preached with raw passion. He told the people that the Holy Land was in danger, that Christ himself was calling them to take up the cross. To farmers, he promised fertile lands in the East. To beggars, he promised freedom. To sinners, he offered forgiveness and eternal salvation. Crowds gathered around him, not out of duty, but out of desperation and hope. Women wept, men raised their hands, and children followed. believing they were chosen for something greater. Unlike the nobles preparing armies of knights, Peter gathered thousands of ordinary men and women, peasants, artisans, even children, all convinced that they, too, could march to Jerusalem. This was no polished army. It was a movement of faith and frenzy, born not in castles, but in the dusty streets of Europe. And so, under the burning words of Peter the Hermit, the People's Crusade was born, a tide of humanity surging toward the unknown, carrying both faith and folly in their hearts. Asterisk, the fire that Peter the Hermit ignited did not stay confined to a single village. Like sparks carried by the wind, his words leapt across fields and forests, from quiet hamlets to bustling towns, until all of France seemed to echo with his cry. Peasants left their plows in the soil, their oxen still tethered in the fields, and streamed into the roads. Artisans abandoned their workshops, their half-finished tools and crafts gathering dust, as they too took up the wooden cross. Even women and children, who had never dreamed of leaving their villages, now walked with eyes lifted toward Jerusalem. For the first time in their lives, the poor and forgotten felt chosen. Chosen not by lords or kings, but by God himself. Each step they took was heavy with hunger and exhaustion, yet lightened by the promise of eternal salvation. They had no armor, no training, and many marched barefoot, their feet bloodied by stone and earth. Still, they sang hymns, clutched wooden crosses, and carried a faith that burned brighter than any sword. Nobles and knights watched in astonishment. Some laughed at the ragged procession, dismissing them as fanatics. Others saw in their zeal a power that no army could match. Whether mocked or admired, none could deny that something was shifting in Christendom. This was no longer the command of a pope alone, nor the vision of kings. This was the voice of the people, raw, desperate, and unstoppable. From the narrow lanes of France to the marketplaces of Germany and Italy, the cry spread, "God wills it! God wills it!" An unstoppable tide of faith had begun to roll across Europe, carrying beggars, farmers, women, and children all toward a single city. To them, Jerusalem was not just a destination. It was heaven on earth. The crusade had already begun, not on the battlefield, not in the councils of kings, but in the restless and hungry hearts of the common people. While peasants filled the roads with song and prayer, whispers carried far beyond the villages. They reached the cold stone halls of Europe's castles, where armored knights and proud lords gathered by torchlight. At first, many laughed in disbelief. Peasants, farmers, beggars, women, even children, marching east with wooden crosses in their hands? How could such a fragile mass hope to free the holy city of Jerusalem? But laughter soon gave way to unease. For in the eyes of these nobles, it was both insult and inspiration. How could barefoot peasants, men of the soil and toil, take up the cross before those born to war? How could commoners lead a movement while knights remained behind stone walls? And so pride stirred. Honor demanded an answer. Across the kingdoms of France, Germany, and Italy, the great lords began to pledge their banners. Their swords, their horses, their gold, all would be offered to the cause. For the peasants, this was faith. For the nobles, it was faith mixed with ambition. A crusade promised not only salvation, but glory on the battlefield, land to conquer, and eternal honor written into the chronicles of history. Blacksmiths worked day and night, forging steel for the long march ahead. Families packed provisions, while priests blessed warriors and their banners. In halls of power, kings and dukes quietly weighed their chances, some fearing to lose their vassals, others eager to seize new dominions. What began as a people's movement was no longer just peasants with wooden staffs and fervent hymns. It was transforming into an army unlike anything Christendom had ever seen. Where the peasants brought unshakable faith, the nobles brought discipline, organization, and steel. Together, they would march not as scattered pilgrims, but as the host of Christ. The earth trembled with the preparations of thousands. Hooves thundered, carts rolled, drums sounded, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Europe was no longer watching. Europe was moving. The world itself was shifting, and in the heart of every crusader, whether peasant or noble, one vision blazed above all others. Jerusalem was calling. The roads of Europe thundered beneath countless feet. From the smallest hamlets to the grandest cities, streams of men, women, and children poured forth, all moving eastward with one name, burning on their lips, Jerusalem. Never before had Christendom witnessed such a sight. Knights in shining armor marched beside barefoot peasants. Merchants left behind their shops, and farmers abandoned their fields, all drawn by the promise of salvation and glory. Along the dusty roads, banners snapped in the wind, some painted with noble crests, others nothing more than crude crosses daubed in blood or ash. It did not matter. Every banner told the same story. This was no longer a scattered pilgrimage. It was a single, unstoppable tide. Songs of devotion echoed across valleys. Children sang hymns as they walked, mothers clutched rosaries, and priests carried relics high above the crowds, as if heaven itself were marching with them. Yet beneath the chants and the prayers ran another current, one of rivalry and ambition. Each lord, each knight, each noble dreamed of land, of power, of immortal fame to be won in the east. Hope and hunger walked side by side. Some saw the journey as a holy offering, others as a holy conquest. But whether driven by faith or by greed, they marched together, united under the banner of the cross. Villages trembled as the armies passed through. Fields emptied, workshops fell silent, and taverns grew deserted. Europe itself seemed to empty into the roads, as if an entire continent had risen and begun to walk. And somewhere at the heart of this vast movement, voices whispered that this was only the beginning. The true test still lay ahead, beyond the rivers, beyond the mountains, beyond the endless roads. Jerusalem awaited, distant yet blazing in every crusader's imagination. The march of the crusade had begun. From every corner of Europe, streams of humanity poured eastward, nobles, peasants, priests, and beggars, all walking the same dusty roads. At the head of this tide stood the church, its voice thundering through the words of Pope Urban II. His promise was clear: forgiveness of sins, eternal salvation, and glory beyond death. For many, this was a holy pilgrimage. For others, it was a chance for power and wealth. But together, they carried a single symbol that bound them all: the cross. The roads shook beneath the tramp of countless feet, the clang of armor, and the cries of hymns that rose into the sky like prayers carried by the wind. Europe had risen, and nothing would stop it now. Not hunger, not distance, not fear. For the Holy Land had become more than a destination. It was a vision, a promise, a destiny. And so, as the sun set on a divided Europe, it rose on a united Christendom. A tide of faith and fury had begun to move, and the world would never be the same again. And so the first spark of the Crusades had been lit. But this was only the beginning. Ahead lay hunger, betrayal, battles of faith and blood, and a journey that would reshape the world. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to Sun Gurru so you don't miss the next chapter of this epic saga. Tell us in the comments, would you have answered Pope Urban's call? The march to Jerusalem has begun, and the story continues in the next episode.